I'm Louise Bennett, 73 years old, and until 3 months ago I thought my children putting me in Sunshine Manor was an act of love. I thought they were protecting me, keeping me safe after my fall in the kitchen. I thought the concerned looks, the hushed conversations about my well-being, the gentle insistence that I needed professional care. I thought it all came from a place of genuine worry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing in the sterile hallway of this place at 2 in the morning, clutching a folder full of documents that would make your blood boil, I now know the truth. My children didn't put me here because they love me. They put me here because they needed me out of the way. And what I discovered tonight about why they really wanted me gone? Well, let's just say it's about to cost them more than they ever imagined. The night nurse, Patricia, doesn't know I'm awake. She doesn't know I've been pretending to take my evening medications for weeks, hiding them under my tongue and spitting them out later. She doesn't know that the confused, medicated elderly woman my children visit twice a week is an act I've been perfecting. And she certainly doesn't know that the woman she thinks is just another forgotten resident has been quietly gathering evidence that's about to turn this entire facility upside down. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this all started. How a simple conversation with my roommate opened my eyes to something so calculated, so cruel, that it made me realize I'd been living with strangers for the past 40 years. Because what I found out about my own family, about this place, and about the woman who thought she could fool a retired accountant who spent 30 years auditing businesses for the state, well, that's a story worth telling. The morning that changed my life forever started like every other morning at Sunshine Manor. Bland oatmeal served at 7 sharp, medications dispensed like clockwork at 8, and the endless drone of daytime television filling the common room by 9. I'd been here for 3 months, ever since my daughter Rebecca convinced me that my dizzy spell in the kitchen was actually a serious fall that proved I could no longer live independently. "Mom, we found you unconscious on the floor," she'd said, holding my hand in that patronizing way that made me feel like a child. "The doctors said you could have died. We can't risk that happening again." My son David had nodded along, playing the dutiful supporter to his sister's dramatic performance. "The facility Rebecca found is beautiful, Mom. It's more like a resort than a nursing home. You'll have friends, activities, professional care. It's what Dad would have wanted." Bringing up my deceased husband Frank was a low blow, but it worked. Grief has a way of making you question everything, including your own judgment. So I'd agreed, thinking maybe they were right. Maybe I was becoming a burden. Maybe this was the responsible thing to do. For weeks, I tried to convince myself this was my new normal. I attended the craft sessions where we made tissue paper flowers that no one wanted. I participated in chair exercises led by an overly enthusiastic therapist named Brenda, who spoke to us like we were kindergartners. I even joined the book club, though calling it that was generous, since most participants couldn't remember what they'd read 5 minutes after the session ended. But something felt wrong from the beginning. It wasn't just the institutional food or the way the staff talked over us like we weren't there. It was the way my children behaved during their visits. Rebecca would arrive with flowers and forced smiles, asking about my meals and my sleep but never really listening to my answers. David would check his phone constantly, nodding at appropriate intervals while I spoke. They seemed relieved when visiting hours ended, hurrying out with promises to see me soon that felt hollow. The first real crack in their facade came during a visit in early November. Rebecca was telling me about her new promotion at the marketing firm, describing her corner office and company car with the kind of enthusiasm she'd never shown for anything when she lived at home. David was scrolling through his phone, occasionally making impressed sounds at his sister's story. "That's wonderful, honey," I said, genuinely happy for her success despite my growing unease. "Your father would be so proud. He always said you had a head for business." Rebecca's smile faltered for just a moment, and I caught something in her expression I'd never seen before. It was quickly replaced by her usual mask, but that brief flash looked suspiciously like guilt. "Speaking of business," David said without looking up from his screen, "have you thought any more about what we discussed? About the house?" I hadn't thought about it because we'd never discussed it. "What about the house?" Rebecca shot her brother a sharp look. "Nothing urgent, Mom. We just think it might be smart to put it on the market." While the real estate market is good, the money could help pay for your care here. But I'm not selling the house, I said, confused. That's my home. That's where your father and I built our life. Mom, Rebecca's voice took on that patient tone again. You're not going back there. This is your home now. Keeping the house is just impractical. The conversation moved on to other topics, but that word, impractical, stuck in my mind like a splinter. Everything about my old life was apparently impractical now. My independence, my memories, my right to make decisions about my own property. That night, I lay in my narrow bed listening to my roommate, Martha, talk in her sleep. Martha was 86 and had been at Sunshine Manor for 2 years. During the day, she seemed confused and disoriented, but sometimes at night, in those moments between sleep and waking, she was remarkably lucid. They think we don't know, she whispered suddenly, her voice clear and sharp in the darkness. Know what, Martha? About the money. About what they're really doing. She turned toward me, and in the dim light from the hallway, her eyes looked more alert than I'd seen them in weeks. My grandson thinks I don't understand what power of attorney means. He thinks I don't remember signing those papers. I sat up in bed. What papers? The ones that give him control of my finances. He said it was temporary, just until I got better. But Louise, honey, nobody gets better in here. That's not what this place is for. Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the overly air-conditioned room. What do you mean? Martha was quiet for so long I thought she'd fallen back asleep. Then she spoke again, her voice barely audible. Check your bank accounts, Louise. Check them before it's too late. The next morning, Martha was back to her usual confused state, asking me repeatedly if I'd seen her husband who'd been dead for 10 years. But her words from the night before echoed in my mind. I'd been so focused on adjusting to life at Sunshine Manor that I hadn't thought about my finances beyond the monthly statements Rebecca said she was handling for me. It's one less thing for you to worry about, Mom, Rebecca had assured me. I'll make sure all your bills are paid on time. You just focus on getting better. But I wasn't sick. I'd never been sick. I'd had a dizzy spell, possibly from the new blood pressure medication my doctor had prescribed. The fall, Rebecca described, was me sitting down quickly when I felt lightheaded. I hadn't lost consciousness. I hadn't been found on the floor. But somehow, that minor incident had become a medical emergency that required immediate placement in long-term care. During activity time that afternoon, while Brenda led the group in a rousing game of bingo, I asked to use the phone. The staff had taken my cell phone on my first day, claiming it was for my own safety since I might get confused and call people at inappropriate hours. The communal phone in the hallway was monitored, they said, to ensure we didn't accidentally.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Give out personal information to scammers. I need to call my bank, I told the aide. A young woman named Stephanie who always spoke to me like I was mildly intellectually disabled. Oh, sweetie, your daughter handles all that now, remember? She's taking such good care of you. I just want to check my balance. Now, why would you need to do that? You don't have any expenses here. Everything's taken care of. The casual dismissal of my request felt like a slap. I was a grown woman, a retired professional who'd managed my own finances for over 50 years, and suddenly I needed permission to access my own money? That evening, I waited until the night shift change at 11 o'clock. The staff was always distracted during the transition, focused on their reports and medication counts. I slipped out of my room and made my way to the small business center near the front desk, a single computer that residents were supposedly allowed to use for staying in touch with family. The computer was password protected, but I'd watched the day administrator, Mrs. Chen, log in several times. Her password was Sunshine 123, not exactly Fort Knox security. I accessed my online banking, my heart pounding as I waited for the page to load. What I saw made my hands shake so badly I could barely operate the mouse. My checking account, which had held over $30,000 3 months ago, now showed a balance of $812. My savings account, my emergency fund that I'd built up over decades of careful budgeting, was completely empty. I stared at the screen, certain I was looking at someone else's account, but there was my name, my account numbers, and a long list of withdrawals and transfers dating back to the day after I'd arrived at Sunshine Manor. Large sums had been moved to accounts I didn't recognize. Checks had been written to companies I'd never heard of. Someone had been systematically draining my life savings while I sat in a nursing home, eating pudding cups and pretending to enjoy chair yoga. The transactions weren't random. They were too organized, too deliberate. Someone with authorized access to my accounts was stealing from me in a way that looked almost legitimate on paper. The amounts were varied, sometimes $500, sometimes $3,000, never enough at once to trigger automatic fraud alerts, but collectively devastating. I printed out the statements, my hands trembling as I folded the papers and tucked them into my robe. The evidence was right there in black and white, but I still couldn't fully process what I was seeing. My own children, the people I'd trusted with my care, my well-being, my future, were robbing me blind. Back in my room, Martha was awake again, sitting up in bed with that same alert expression she got during her lucid moments. "You found it, didn't you?" she said quietly. "How did you know?" Same look I had when I figured it out, like someone punched you in the stomach and you can't catch your breath. She leaned closer. "How much?" "Almost everything," I whispered. $47,000 gone in 3 months. Martha nodded grimly. "My grandson got $60,000 before I caught on. Told everyone I was getting confused about money, that I was trying to give cash to door-to-door scammers. Made himself look like a hero for stepping in to protect me." "What did you do?" "Nothing," Martha said, and the defeat in her voice was heartbreaking. "What could I do? I'm stuck in here. No one believes us when we try to tell them what's happening. They think we're confused, paranoid. And legally, I gave him power of attorney. On paper, he's allowed to manage my money however he sees fit. But that's not what power of attorney is for. You try explaining that to someone who thinks you can't remember your own name half the time." Martha lay back down, suddenly looking every one of her 86 years. "At least you found out early. 3 months versus 2 years. You might still be able to do something about it." I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd discovered. My children, the babies I'd nursed through fevers, the teenagers I'd driven to countless activities, the adults I'd helped through college and early careers and marriages, were stealing from me. Not just taking money, but orchestrating an elaborate scheme that involved convincing me I needed long-term care, taking control of my finances, and systematically emptying my accounts while I was trapped in a facility I'd never needed to be in. The next morning brought a surprise visit from Rebecca. She arrived during breakfast, which was unusual since she typically came on weekends with David. She looked stressed, her usually perfect hair slightly mussed, and her makeup not quite as polished as normal. "Hi, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek with lips that felt cold. "How are you feeling today?" "I'm fine, honey. This is a surprise. I was in the neighborhood for a work thing. Thought I'd stop by." She sat down across from me at the small table in my room, fidgeting with her purse strap. "I wanted to talk to you about something." My heart rate picked up, but I kept my expression neutral. "What's that?" "Well, you know how we discussed the house situation? David and I have been thinking, and we really do believe it's time to sell. The market is incredible right now, and the maintenance costs are just eating away at your savings." I watched her face carefully as she spoke. 3 months ago, I would have taken her words at face value, trusted that she had my best interests at heart. Now, with the bank statements hidden in my dresser drawer, I could see the performance for what it was. "What maintenance costs?" I asked. Rebecca blinked, momentarily thrown off her script. "Well, you know. The usual things. Utilities, insurance, upkeep." "The house is paid off, Rebecca." "The utilities are on budget billing, and I paid the insurance premium for the full year last January. What specific maintenance issues are you referring to?" She looked uncomfortable, shifting in her chair. "Mom, you don't need to worry about the details. That's why David and I are handling things for you. We just need you to sign some papers so we can move forward with the sale." "What papers?" "Just real estate documents. Nothing complicated. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. The realtor needs authorization to list the property. I opened the folder and began reading, taking my time despite Rebecca's obvious impatience. The documents weren't just listing agreements. They included power of attorney forms, estate planning changes, and what looked suspiciously like authorization for Rebecca to access and manage all of my financial accounts. "This isn't just about selling the house," I said. "Mom, it's all related. The lawyer said it's easier to handle everything at once. You know how complicated legal stuff can be." She was talking to me like I was a child again, using that patient tone that assumed I couldn't understand basic concepts. But I'd spent 3 decades reviewing financial documents for the state. I knew exactly what these papers meant, and I knew that signing them would give Rebecca complete control over every aspect of my life and finances. "I need time to review these properly." "There's really no need, Mom. David and I have already gone through everything with the lawyer. It's all standard stuff." "Then you won't mind if I take a day or two to read through them myself?" Rebecca's facade slipped for just a moment, and I saw something flash across her face that looked remarkably like panic. "The thing is, the realtor needs these back today. The market is moving so fast right now, and if we don't act quickly, we might lose the opportunity." "What opportunity? You haven't even listed the house yet." "We have someone interested, a cash buyer. But they need to know we have full authority to proceed with the sale." I closed the folder and set it aside. "I'm not signing anything today, Rebecca. I want to have my own lawyer review these documents." "Mom, you don't have a lawyer." "Dad's old attorney retired years ago." "Then I'll find a new one." Rebecca stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "You're being unreasonable. David and I are trying to help you, and you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be." "I'm being careful with important decisions." "That's not unreasonable." "Fine," she said, shoving the folder back into her purse. "But don't blame us when you miss out on this opportunity. And don't expect us to keep running around handling crises when you won't let us do our job properly." She left without her usual goodbye kiss, and I could hear her heels clicking angrily down the hallway. For the first time since I'd been at Sunshine Manor, I felt like I'd won a small victory. But I also knew that my refusal to sign those documents had probably accelerated whatever timeline my children were working with. That afternoon, I used the computer again to research power of attorney laws and elder financial abuse. What I found made my blood run cold. Everything Martha had told me was true. Adult children gaining power of attorney over elderly parents and then systematically draining their accounts was more common than I'd ever imagined. The legal system was set up in a way that made it nearly impossible for victims to prove abuse, especially when they were living in care facilities and could be easily dismissed as confused or incompetent. But I had advantages that many victims didn't. I was mentally sharp, I had documentation of the unauthorized withdrawals, and I hadn't yet signed away my legal rights. The question was what to do with those advantages before my children realized I was onto their scheme. I printed out more bank statements, going back 6 months to establish a pattern. I also looked up the companies that had received payments from my accounts. Most were shell corporations with no real business presence, exactly the kind of entities someone would create to launder stolen money. The whole operation was sophisticated enough to suggest planning and professional help. As I sat in that sterile business center, surrounded by the sounds of a facility designed to warehouse forgotten elderly people, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to sit quietly while my children destroyed my financial security and my autonomy. And I certainly wasn't going to let them get away with treating me like I was too stupid or too senile to understand what they were doing. Martha had been right about one thing. Nobody gets better in places like Sunshine Manor. But what she didn't know was that sometimes people don't need to get better. Sometimes they just need to get even. The evening brought another surprise. David arrived during dinner, which was unprecedented since he never visited on weekdays. He looked agitated, checking his phone constantly and barely touching the coffee the aide brought him. "Rebecca said you had some concerns about the house documents," he said without preamble. "I want my own legal representation before I sign anything." "Mom, that's gonna cost money. Lawyers aren't cheap, and your finances are already stretched pretty thin." I almost laughed at the audacity of that statement. My finances were stretched thin because someone had been stealing from me for months, and now my own son was concerned about legal fees? How exactly are my finances stretched thin, David? I have a pension, Social Security, and what should be substantial savings. Well, this place isn't cheap, and there have been some unexpected medical expenses. What medical expenses? I'm not taking any medications I wasn't taking at home, and I haven't seen a doctor since my admission physical. David looked uncomfortable, much like his sister had earlier. There are always incidental costs. And the facility fees are higher than we initially budgeted for. Show me the bills. What? If there are medical expenses and facility fees that are draining my accounts, I want to see the actual bills. I want to understand where my money is going. Mom, Rebecca handles all that paperwork. I don't have access to the specific invoices, but you just told me about unexpected medical expenses. How do you know about them if you don't have access to the bills? David stood up, clearly frustrated with the direction of the conversation. Look, we're trying to help you here. But if you want to make this difficult, if you want to waste money on lawyers and create problems where there aren't any, that's your choice. Just don't expect us to clean up the mess when everything falls apart. What mess? What exactly do you think is going to fall apart? Forget it, he said, heading for the door. When you're ready to be reasonable, let us know. After he left, I sat in my room thinking about the word reasonable. In my children's vocabulary, being reasonable meant accepting their version of reality without question. It meant signing documents I hadn't read, accepting financial arrangements I hadn't authorized, and trusting people who were systematically robbing me. But I'd been reasonable my entire life. I'd been reasonable when Frank died and left me to navigate widowhood alone. I'd been reasonable when the kids needed money for college, for weddings, for house down payments. I'd been reasonable when they suggested I needed professional care after a minor dizzy spell. And being reasonable had gotten me exactly where I was now. Trapped in a facility I didn't need, watching my life savings disappear while my own children treated me like an inconvenient problem to be managed. That night, Martha was more lucid than I'd ever seen her. She sat up in bed and looked at me with clear, sharp eyes. "They know you know," she said quietly. "How can you tell?" "Because they're moving faster now. When they think you're catching on, they speed up the timeline. My grandson did the same thing. Started taking bigger amounts, pushing harder for me to sign more papers. What should I do?" Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked crafty instead of confused. "You know what your problem is, Louise? You're thinking like a victim. You're thinking about how to protect what you have left instead of how to get back what they took. I don't understand. They put you in here to control you. They took your money because they thought you couldn't stop them. But what if you stopped playing defense and started playing offense?" "What do you mean?" Martha leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if instead of trying to get out of here, you found a way to take control of this place? What if instead of fighting their game, you changed the rules entirely?" Her words planted a seed that would grow into something much bigger than either of us could have imagined. Because Martha was right. I'd been thinking like a victim, reacting to my children's moves instead of making my own. But I wasn't just any victim. I was a woman who'd spent 30 years auditing businesses, who understood financial structures and legal vulnerabilities. I was someone who knew how to research, how to investigate, and how to build a case that would hold up under scrutiny. And most importantly, I was someone who was getting very, very angry. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. While the other residents shuffled through their morning routines, I began planning something that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to find out exactly who was behind the systematic theft of my money, how deep the conspiracy went, and what legal vulnerabilities existed in their operation. But more than that, I was going to make sure they paid for what they'd done. Not just to me, but to Martha, and who knew how many other vulnerable people they'd targeted. Because if my children thought they could warehouse me in Sunshine Manor while they destroyed my life's work, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to be the one making the rules. The investigation began at 5:30 in the morning, during the quiet hour when the night staff was finishing their paperwork and the day shift hadn't yet arrived. I'd learned that Sunshine Manor had a rhythm, predictable patterns that could be exploited if you knew what to look for. The business center was always empty during shift changes. The medication room was unattended for exactly 12 minutes while nurses completed their handoff reports, and the administrative offices were accessible through a service corridor that most residents didn't even know existed. I'd spent the previous 3 days mapping out these vulnerabilities, pretending to be confused about directions while actually memorizing which doors were locked, which required keycards, and which were left open for staff convenience. The cleaning crew arrived at 6, worked from the top floor down, and always propped open office doors while they emptied trash bins. Mrs. Chen, the facility administrator, never arrived before 8:30, but she kept files in an unlocked cabinet that faced away from the hallway. My target wasn't just information about my own situation anymore. Martha's suggestion about taking control rather than simply defending had evolved into something much more ambitious. If Rebecca and David were systematically draining my accounts, chances were good they weren't the only ones involved. Facilities like Sunshine Manor operated on trust, but that trust created opportunities for organized theft on a scale that could involve multiple families, multiple residents, and possibly staff members who were part of the scheme. I slipped out of my room wearing the institutional bathrobe and slippers that made me invisible to busy staff members. The hallways were dimly lit, designed to discourage nighttime wandering, but I'd practiced this route enough times to navigate without hesitation. The service corridor was behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," but the lock had been broken for weeks, and repair orders moved slowly in a place where residents' comfort was clearly a lower priority than operational costs. The administrative wing smelled like industrial disinfectant and stale coffee. I could hear voices from the nurses' station 2 hallways away, but this section was isolated enough that I could work without interruption. Mrs. Chen's office was the 3rd door on the left, and as expected, she'd left it unlocked. Her computer was password protected, but the filing cabinet was accessible, and that's where the real information was stored anyway. The resident files were organized alphabetically, thick manila folders containing intake forms, medical assessments, family contact information, and financial arrangements. I started with my own file, photographing each page with a small digital camera I'd purchased from the facility's gift shop by telling the volunteer I wanted to take pictures of my room for my grandchildren who lived far away. What I found in my file made my hands shake with rage. The intake assessment described me as confused and disoriented, following a serious fall with loss of consciousness. The medical evaluation noted significant cognitive decline and inability to manage complex financial decisions. There were doctor's notes I'd never seen before, supposedly documenting my deteriorating mental state and recommending immediate placement in long-term care. None of it was true. The doctor listed as the primary evaluator was someone I'd never met. The signatures were supposedly mine, but the handwriting was shaky and uncertain. Nothing like my actual penmanship. Someone had created an entirely fictional medical history to justify my placement at Sunshine Manor, and that someone had access to official letterhead, medical credentials, and the legal authority to make it all look legitimate. But the most damning information was in the financial section. Rebecca was listed as my primary emergency contact and financial power of attorney, but the documents were dated 3 weeks before my supposed fall. According to the paperwork, I had voluntarily granted her access to my accounts and authorization to make decisions about my care while I was still living independently and supposedly in full control of my faculties. I photographed everything, then moved on to Martha's file. Her story was strikingly similar. A minor incident had been exaggerated into a serious health crisis requiring immediate intervention. Her grandson had obtained power of attorney just days before her placement. Her medical assessment described confusion and disorientation that I knew firsthand was completely fabricated. The pattern was so obvious it might as well have been highlighted in yellow marker. I pulled 5 more files at random, choosing residents I knew personally from the dining room and activity sessions. Every single one showed the same pattern. Minor incidents escalated into major health crises. Power of attorney granted to family members just before placement. Medical assessments that described cognitive impairment in people I spoke with daily and knew to be mentally sharp, The scope of what I was discovering went far beyond individual family members taking advantage of elderly relatives. This was organized, systematic, and involved multiple levels of fraud. Someone was creating false medical records, forging signatures, and coordinating with family members to place healthy, competent adults in long-term care facilities where they could be controlled and robbed without interference. I was so focused on the files that I almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I quickly returned the folders to their proper places, slipped the camera into my robe pocket, and moved toward the door. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the jingle of keys and the rustle of clothing. I needed to get out of the administrative wing before whoever was approaching discovered me in an area that was clearly off-limits to residents. The service corridor was my escape route, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard voices just around the corner. Two people were having a quiet conversation, and something about their tone made me freeze and listen instead of running. "The Bennett woman is becoming a problem," a woman's voice was saying. "Rebecca called yesterday in a panic. Said her mother is asking questions about the bank accounts and refusing to sign the additional paperwork." "How much more time do they need?" The second voice was male, older, with the gravelly tone of a long-time smoker. "Another month, maybe 2. They've cleared most of the liquid assets, but there are some retirement accounts that require additional authorization. The house sale should finalize everything. And if she keeps refusing to cooperate, there are ways to handle that. A few adjustments to her medication regimen, maybe a small incident that demonstrates her deteriorating condition. The important thing is maintaining the appearance that everything is being done for her own protection." My blood turned to ice as I realized what I was hearing. These people weren't just enabling my children's theft, they were actively participating in it. They were discussing ways to drug me or stage incidents that would justify further restrictions on my autonomy. The casual tone of their conversation suggested this wasn't the first time they'd had this discussion. And I probably wasn't the first resident they'd targeted. What about the roommate, Martha Collins? "She's not a problem anymore. Her grandson finished liquidating her assets last month. We can move her to the memory care unit anytime we need to free up the bed." Memory care was the locked wing where residents with dementia were housed. Once someone was transferred there, they lost all remaining independence and their families gained complete control over their medical care and finances. Martha's lucid moments, her clear understanding of what was happening to both of us, all of that would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of someone with severe cognitive impairment. The voices were moving away now, but I stayed frozen in place, afraid to move and risk discovery. The conversation I'd overheard had revealed something far worse than simple financial abuse. Sunshine Manor wasn't just a nursing home where some residents happened to be victims of family theft. It was an active participant in organized elder abuse, a facility that deliberately helped families warehouse competent adults so their assets could be stolen without interference. When I finally made it back to my room, Martha was sitting up in bed with that alert expression that meant she was having one of her clear moments. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's bigger than we thought," I whispered. "Much bigger." I told her about the files, the forged medical records, the conversation I'd overheard. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. "How many residents?" she asked when I finished. I only checked 7 files, but all of them showed the same pattern, if it's happening to everyone. I did quick mental math. Sunshine Manor housed about 60 residents. If even half of them were victims of coordinated financial abuse, the total amount of stolen money could be in the millions. "We need help," Martha said. "Real help. Someone outside this place who can investigate without being controlled or dismissed." Who would believe us? We're elderly residents of a nursing home. The moment we start talking about conspiracy and organized theft, we'll be labeled as paranoid or delusional. Martha smiled, and for a moment she looked like the sharp-eyed businesswoman she'd been before her family had her warehoused. "Louise, honey, you're thinking like a victim again. We don't need someone to believe us. We need someone who can verify what we've discovered independently." "What do you mean?" "You've got photographs of the files. You've documented the unauthorized withdrawals from your accounts. You overheard staff members discussing their operation. That's not paranoid rambling. That's evidence. Real evidence that can be investigated and corroborated." She was right, but I still didn't know who to trust with that evidence. Anyone I contacted could be part of the scheme or connected to the people running it. I needed someone with the authority to investigate, the resources to pursue a complex case, and the independence to act without being influenced by local connections. The answer came to me during lunch the next day. I was sitting at my usual table, picking at a sandwich that tasted like cardboard, when I remembered something from my years working for the state. Elder abuse cases that crossed state lines or involved sophisticated fraud operations were often handled by federal agencies. The FBI had specialized units that dealt with organized theft targeting vulnerable populations. They had the resources to investigate complex financial crimes and the authority to pursue cases even when local officials might be compromised. But contacting federal agents would require more than just the evidence I'd gathered so far. I needed to document the full scope of the operation, identify all the key players, and present a case that was compelling enough to warrant a serious investigation. That meant going deeper into Sunshine Manor's operations than a single night of file searching could accomplish. I spent the rest of the week observing and documenting everything I could about the facility's daily operations. I noted which staff members had access to resident files, who handled financial paperwork, and how the administration communicated with families about care decisions. I memorized shift schedules, identified security vulnerabilities, and mapped out every area of the building that might contain useful information. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its efficiency. Sunshine Manor operated like a well-oiled machine, designed to separate elderly residents from their assets while maintaining the appearance of legitimate care. New residents went through a standardized process that included immediate medication assessments, family conferences about financial planning, and care plan updates that gradually restricted their independence and decision-making authority. Dr. Harrison, the facility's medical director, played a crucial role in the operation. He was the one who signed off on the cognitive assessments that justified power of attorney transfers and care restrictions. His evaluations always seemed to support whatever level of control families wanted to exercise, regardless of the resident's actual mental state. Mrs. Chen handled the administrative side, coordinating with families about financial arrangements and legal documentation. She had access to all resident files and maintained relationships with local attorneys who specialized in elder law and estate planning. Her office contained copies of all the financial authorization forms that gave families access to their relatives' accounts. But the most disturbing discovery was the role played by some of the nursing staff. Certain nurses had access to medications that could cause temporary confusion or disorientation, making residents appear more impaired than they actually were. I began paying attention to which residents seemed unusually foggy or disoriented after receiving their evening medications, and I noticed a clear pattern of cognitive suppression that was being used to maintain the illusion of widespread dementia. I documented everything, taking photographs when possible and writing detailed notes when I couldn't use the camera safely. I created maps of the facility, copied medication schedules, and recorded conversations that revealed how the staff coordinated their activities. By the end of the week, I had assembled a comprehensive picture of an organized criminal enterprise that was operating under the cover of providing elder care. But I also knew that my investigation was creating risks. The conversation I'd overheard about adjusting my medication regimen hadn't been theoretical. It was a real threat that could be implemented anytime the staff decided I was becoming too much of a problem. I needed to accelerate my timeline and find a way to get the evidence out of Sunshine Manor before they decided to silence me permanently. The opportunity came during the weekend family visit period. Rebecca and David arrived together on Saturday afternoon, both looking more stressed than I'd seen them since this whole ordeal began. They were clearly coordinating their approach, speaking in low voices before entering my room, and putting on their usual masks of concerned children. "Hi, Mom," Rebecca said, kissing my cheek with the same cold lips I'd noticed before. "You look good today." "I feel fine," I replied, watching their faces carefully. "Better than I have in weeks, actually." David sat down heavily in the visitor chair, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mom, we need to talk about the situation with the house and your finances." "What situation?" "You're running out of money," Rebecca said bluntly. "The costs here are higher than we anticipated, and without selling the house, you're going to exhaust your savings within a few months." I almost laughed at the audacity of that statement, considering they were the ones who had exhausted my savings by stealing most of it. But I maintained my neutral expression and waited for them to continue their performance. "We've found a buyer who's willing to pay cash for the house," David continued. "But we need to move quickly. The offer is only good for another week." "How much are they offering?" Rebecca and David exchanged glances. "It's a fair price," Rebecca said evasively. "Market value, considering the condition of the property." "What's the actual dollar amount?" "Mom, you don't need to worry about the specific numbers," David said. "We've had it appraised, and the offer is reasonable. I knew my house was worth at least $400,000, possibly more in the current market." The fact that they wouldn't give me a specific number suggested the buyer was either offering significantly less than market value or didn't exist at all. "I want to see the purchase agreement," I said. "There isn't one yet," Rebecca replied quickly. "That's why we need you to sign the listing authorization. The buyer wants to make sure we have full authority to proceed before they submit their formal offer. So there's no actual offer. You want me to sign papers giving you the right to sell my house based on a conversation with someone who might be interested." "Mom, this is how real estate works," David said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You have to establish your authority to sell before buyers will negotiate seriously." "I've bought and sold property before, David. I understand how real estate works. And what you're describing isn't standard procedure." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd come to hate. "Mom, I know this is confusing. There are a lot of moving parts, and it's natural to feel overwhelmed. That's why David and I are handling the details for you." "I'm not confused, Rebecca. I'm being careful with an important decision." "You're being stubborn," David snapped. "We're trying to help you, and you're making everything more difficult than it needs to be." "Help me how? By selling my house to an unnamed buyer for an undisclosed amount? By taking control of my finances without my knowledge? By placing me in a facility I never needed to be in?" The last question hung in the air like a bomb. Both of my children went very still, their facades finally cracking to reveal the panic underneath. "What are you talking about?" Rebecca asked, but her voice was too high, too defensive. "I'm talking about the fact that I never lost consciousness when I had that dizzy spell. I'm talking about medical records that describe conditions I don't have. I'm talking about power of attorney documents that were supposedly signed before I was even brought here." David stood up abruptly. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. The stress of being here is obviously affecting your judgment." "My judgment is fine. It's my bank accounts that are empty." Rebecca's face went white. "What do you mean?" "I mean that $47,000 has disappeared from my accounts since I've been here. Money that was transferred to companies I've never heard of, by people who had no authorization to access my finances." "That's impossible," David said, but he was backing toward the door. "You must be misunderstanding the statements." "I understand them perfectly. What I don't understand is how my own children could steal from me while pretending to be concerned about my welfare." Rebecca was on her feet now, grabbing her purse and moving toward the exit. "We don't have to listen to this. You're clearly having some kind of episode." "The only episode I'm having is clarity," I said, standing up to face them both. "For the first time in months, I can see exactly what's been happening to me." "We'll talk to Dr. Harrison about adjusting your medications," David said as they headed for the door. "You're obviously not as stable as we thought." They left quickly, their masks completely abandoned now that they knew I was onto their scheme. But their threat about adjusting my medications confirmed what I'd suspected. They were going to escalate their efforts to control me now that I'd revealed my awareness of their theft. I had perhaps hours before they implemented whatever plan they had to silence me. Dr. Harrison would be contacted, medications would be changed, and I would suddenly become the confused, disoriented elderly woman their paperwork had always claimed I was. Once that happened, nothing I said would be believed by anyone in authority. I needed to act immediately. That evening, during the dinner hour when most staff was focused on meal service, I made my way back to the business center. I had composed a detailed letter describing everything I'd discovered, attaching copies of all the photographic evidence I'd gathered. The letter was addressed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, with copies to the State Attorney General's office and the local district attorney. But sending the letter wouldn't be enough. I needed insurance, something that would guarantee my safety even if my children and their conspirators tried to discredit me. I needed leverage that would force them to back down or face consequences they couldn't control. The answer was sitting right in front of me in Mrs. Chen's filing cabinet. The resident files I'd photographed contained evidence of systematic fraud involving dozens of families and millions of dollars in stolen assets. If that information were made public, it would destroy everyone involved in the scheme and trigger investigations that could result in serious federal charges. I photographed every single file in the cabinet, documenting the full scope of Sunshine Manor's operation. It took 3 hours and filled 2 memory cards, but when I was finished, I had evidence of the largest organized elder abuse scheme I'd ever imagined. The documentation was so comprehensive that it could be independently verified by investigators, making it impossible for anyone to dismiss as the confused ramblings of an elderly nursing home resident. I uploaded everything to a secure cloud storage account, with automatic distribution instructions that would send copies to multiple news outlets and law enforcement agencies if I failed to check in within 72 hours. I also prepared physical copies of the most damning evidence, hiding them in locations around the facility where they would be found even if something happened to me. By dawn, I had created a dead man's switch that would expose the entire operation if anyone tried to silence me. But I wasn't planning to wait for them to make the first move. I was going to take Martha's advice and go on the offensive. The game was about to change, and this time, I was going to be the one making the rules. When Rebecca and David returned the next morning with Dr. Harrison in tow, I was ready for them. They found me in the common room, sitting calmly with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, looking like any other elderly resident enjoying a quiet morning. "Mrs. Bennett," Dr. Harrison said in his practiced bedside manner voice, "your children are concerned about some confusion you experienced yesterday. I'd like to do a quick evaluation to make sure you're feeling all right." "I'm feeling perfectly clear, doctor. Clearer than I've felt in months, actually." "That's good to hear. But sometimes stress can cause temporary disorientation. And it's important that we monitor your condition carefully." "What kind of monitoring did you have in mind?" "Just some adjustments to your medication regimen, perhaps a mild sedative to help with anxiety. Nothing dramatic, just something to help you feel more comfortable." I smiled at him, the same pleasant expression I'd worn for 3 months while everyone around me assumed I was helpless. "Doctor, before we discuss medication changes, I have a question about my medical records." "Of course. According to the file in Mrs. Chen's office, you evaluated me on September 15th and determined that I was suffering from significant cognitive decline. Do you remember that evaluation?" Dr. Harrison's expression flickered slightly. "I see many patients, Mrs. Bennett. I'd have to review your file to recall the specifics." "That's interesting, because September 15th was 3 days before I was admitted to this facility. And I've never met you before today." The room went very quiet. Rebecca and David were staring at Dr. Harrison, clearly expecting him to handle the situation. But the doctor was looking distinctly uncomfortable, probably wondering how a confused elderly woman had gained access to her medical files. "Perhaps there's been some confusion about dates," he said carefully. "Perhaps there's been some confusion about a lot of things," I replied. "Would you like me to show you the photographs I took of my file? Or the bank statements showing $47,000 in unauthorized withdrawals? Or maybe the recording I made of staff members discussing how to drug me into compliance?" Dr. Harrison stood up abruptly. "I think this conversation should continue in my office." "I think this conversation should continue with federal investigators," I said. "Which it will, starting tomorrow morning." David was backing toward the door again. "Mom, you're having another episode. We should let Dr. Harrison examine you properly." "The only episode I'm having is called Fighting Back," I said, standing to face all 3 of them. "And unless you want to see just how much evidence I've gathered about your little operation here, I suggest you start listening instead of talking." For the first time since this ordeal began, they were the ones who looked confused and frightened. They were the ones scrambling to understand what was happening. and they were the ones who had suddenly lost control of the situation. I was no longer a victim. I was a woman with documentation, evidence, and a plan, and I was just getting started. The silence that followed my ultimatum stretched like a taut wire. Dr. Harrison's face had drained of color, and I could see the exact moment he realized that his carefully constructed medical fraud was about to collapse. Rebecca was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white, while David kept glancing toward the exit like he was calculating how quickly he could escape. But I wasn't finished with them yet. 3 months of being treated like a helpless invalid had given me plenty of time to plan this moment, and I intended to savor every second of watching them squirm. "Sit down," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used in years. "All of you. We're going to have a conversation about consequences." "Mom, you're clearly not well," Rebecca tried one more time, but her voice lacked conviction. "We should get you some help. The only people here who need help are the ones who've been committing federal crimes," I replied. "Dr. Harrison, how many falsified medical evaluations have you signed? 50? 100? Because I've documented every single resident file in this facility, and the pattern is unmistakable." Dr. Harrison sank into his chair like a deflated balloon. "Mrs. Bennett, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding was mine, thinking I could trust any of you. But that's been corrected." I pulled out my phone, a device I'd kept hidden for weeks, while pretending to be too confused to operate technology. "Would you like to hear the recording I made of Mrs. Chen and her associate discussing plans to drug me into submission?" I pressed play, and their own voices filled the common room. "A few adjustments to her medication regimen, maybe a small incident that demonstrates her deteriorating condition. The important thing is maintaining the appearance that everything is being done for her own protection." David's face went ashen. "Where did you get that?" "From people who thought they were talking privately about how to destroy my life. People who had no idea that their victim was actually gathering evidence of their conspiracy." Dr. Harrison tried to stand again, but I held up my hand. "Stay seated, doctor. We're not done discussing your role in this operation. Tell me, how much do you get paid for each fraudulent evaluation? Is it a flat fee, or do you get a percentage of the assets that families are able to steal?" "I've never taken money for medical evaluations," he protested. "Really? Then what do you call the payments from Caring Family Solutions, the company that Rebecca set up to funnel stolen money? The one that's been paying you $5,000 a month for the past 2 years?" The look of shock on his face told me I'd hit the target. I'd spent hours tracing the financial connections between the various players in this scheme, following money trails through shell companies and dummy corporations. Dr. Harrison's consulting fees were buried in paperwork, designed to look like legitimate medical billing, but the pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. "You've been conducting surveillance on us," Rebecca said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "I've been conducting an investigation into criminal activity targeting vulnerable elderly people. The fact that my own children are at the center of that criminal activity is just particularly heartbreaking." "We're your family," David said desperately. "Whatever problems we've had, we can work them out privately. There's no need to involve outside authorities. You stopped being my family the moment you decided to steal my life savings and warehouse me in a facility I never needed. You became criminals who happened to share my DNA." Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, clearly summoned by someone to help control the situation. But when she saw my phone and realized I was recording everything, she froze like a deer in headlights. "Mrs. Chen," I said pleasantly. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to my children and Dr. Harrison how their fraud scheme is about to be exposed to federal investigators. Would you like to add anything about your role in coordinating the financial aspects of the operation?" She turned and walked away without saying a word, probably heading straight to her office to start shredding documents. But it was too late for damage control. I'd already copied everything important, and her flight would only serve as additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. "What do you want?" Rebecca asked, finally abandoning all pretense. "Money? We can pay back what we took. You can't pay back 3 months of my life. You can't undo the humiliation of being treated like I was mentally incompetent. And you certainly can't restore my trust in people I thought loved me." "Then what?" David demanded. "What's the point of all this?" The point is justice, not just for me, but for Martha and every other resident in this place who's been victimized by your operation. The point is making sure this never happens to anyone else. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat nervously. Mrs. Bennett, perhaps we could discuss a compromise. If there have been irregularities in billing or documentation, we could certainly review those matters and make appropriate corrections. Irregularities? I laughed, a sound that carried no humor at all. Doctor, you've signed false medical evaluations that enabled the theft of millions of dollars from elderly residents. That's not an irregularity. That's organized racketeering. The term hit them like a physical blow. Racketeering carried serious federal penalties, including potential prison time and asset forfeiture. It also meant that local connections and influence wouldn't protect them from prosecution. You're bluffing, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. You're an elderly woman living in a nursing home. No one's going to take your word over medical professionals and family members who've been trying to care for you. You're right that no one would take my word alone, I agreed. But they will take comprehensive documentation, recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from multiple victims. They'll also take very seriously the fact that this conspiracy involves mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of federal elder abuse statutes. I stood up, feeling stronger and more confident than I had in years. Here's what's going to happen. In exactly 1 hour, I'm going to call the FBI field office and report this entire operation. I'm going to provide them with everything I've documented, including evidence of your participation in systematic financial crimes. Mom, please, David said desperately. We can fix this. We can make it right. You had 3 months to make it right. Instead, you doubled down on your theft and started planning to drug me into submission. The time for family discussions is over. Dr. Harrison was practically hyperventilating. Mrs. Bennett, I think you may be overestimating the significance of what you've discovered. Nursing home administration involves many complex financial and medical decisions that can appear irregular to someone without proper training. Doctor, I spent 30 years auditing financial crimes for the state government. I know exactly what systematic fraud looks like, and I know exactly how federal prosecutors will view your operation. Rebecca was crying now, tears of frustration and fear rather than genuine remorse. You're going to destroy your own family. Is that really what you want? You destroyed this family when you decided to steal from me. I'm just making sure there are consequences for your choices. What about forgiveness? David asked. What about giving us a chance to make amends? Forgiveness is for mistakes, not deliberate cruelty. What you did wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was a calculated campaign to rob me while keeping me helpless to stop you. Mrs. Chen reappeared with 2 security guards, clearly hoping to intimidate me into backing down. But I'd anticipated this move and prepared for it. Gentlemen, I said to the guards, I'm going to give you some advice that could save your careers. This facility is about to be raided by federal agents investigating organized financial crimes. Any attempt to intimidate or silence witnesses will be viewed as obstruction of justice. The guards looked confused, glancing between Mrs. Chen and me like they couldn't figure out who was in charge of the situation. Furthermore, I continued, I've already uploaded copies of all evidence to a secure server with instructions for automatic distribution if anything happens to me. Trying to silence me at this point would only accelerate your exposure and add additional federal charges. Mrs. Chen whispered something to the guards, and they retreated to a respectful distance. She'd clearly realized that heavy-handed tactics would only make their situation worse. Mrs. Bennett, she said carefully, I think there may be some misunderstandings about standard nursing home procedures. Perhaps we could sit down and review any concerns you have about your care or billing. Mrs. Chen, I have photographs of resident files showing systematic falsification of medical records. I have recordings of your staff discussing plans to drug residents who become problematic. I have financial records documenting the theft of millions of dollars from vulnerable elderly people. There's nothing to misunderstand. Her composure finally cracked. What do you want from us? I want you to understand that your operation is finished. The FBI will be here within hours, and they'll have warrants for documents, computer systems, and financial records. They'll interview every resident, every staff member, and every family member involved in suspicious financial arrangements. And then what? Rebecca asked bitterly. You send your own children to prison? You destroy dozens of families? I expose a criminal enterprise that's been preying on vulnerable elderly people. If that happens to include my children, then you should have thought about consequences before you decided to become thieves. Dr. Harrison made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. Mrs. Bennett, I'm concerned that this level of agitation and paranoia may indicate a serious psychiatric condition. Perhaps we should consider immediate medication to help you calm down. Doctor, if you come near me with any kind of medication, I will consider it assault with a deadly weapon. And given that this conversation is being recorded and transmitted in real time to multiple secure locations, you might want to consider how that would look to a federal jury. The bluff worked perfectly. Dr. Harrison sank back into his chair, realizing that any aggressive action would only provide additional evidence for prosecutors. Martha appeared in the doorway of the common room, moving with more purpose and clarity than I'd seen from her in months. She was carrying a thick manila folder and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. "Louise," she said, her voice strong and clear, "I thought you might need this." She handed me the folder, which contained copies of financial documents, medication records, and handwritten notes documenting her own experience with the theft scheme. "I've been keeping records too," she explained. "Every conversation with my grandson, every suspicious medication change, every time staff members discussed my case when they thought I couldn't understand. It turns out that being underestimated can be a powerful advantage." Rebecca stared at Martha like she was seeing a ghost. "You're supposed to be in the memory care unit." "I'm supposed to be a lot of things, according to the people who've been stealing from me. But it turns out that pretending to be confused is an excellent way to overhear conversations that people think are private." Dr. Harrison was staring at both of us with growing horror. "This is impossible. Both of you have documented cognitive impairments." "No, doctor," I corrected him. "Both of us have falsified evaluations that you signed without ever actually examining us. There's a significant difference." Martha opened her folder and pulled out a small recording device. "I've been documenting everything for the past 6 months. Every conversation, every medication change, every time someone discussed how to steal more money from my accounts." "How many others?" I asked. "At least 20 residents have been victimized by the same scheme. Some of them are genuinely confused now because of the medications they've been given. But others are just pretending to be incompetent because it's safer than fighting back." The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than I'd realized. This wasn't just about my family or Martha's grandson. It was a systematic operation involving dozens of families and potentially millions of dollars in stolen assets. "Mrs. Chen," I said, "I think it's time for you to start making phone calls. You're going to want to contact attorneys, because this situation is about to become very public and very expensive for everyone involved." She was already backing toward the exit, probably planning to flee before law enforcement arrived. But I'd anticipated that possibility too. I should mention that I've already provided descriptions and contact information for all key personnel to the FBI. Running won't help you at this point. It will only add fleeing to avoid prosecution to your list of charges. "You're bluffing," David said again, but his voice was hollow. "You don't have the connections or resources to coordinate something like this." "David, I spent 3 decades investigating financial crimes for the state. I know exactly who to call and exactly what evidence they need to build a case. I also know that elder abuse cases involving organized racketeering are high-priority investigations that get fast-tracked through the system." Rebecca was sobbing openly now. "Mom, please. We can return the money. We can make everything right." "You can't return 3 months of my life that you stole. You can't undo the trauma of being betrayed by people I trusted completely. And you can't restore my faith in family." "We're still your children," she pleaded. "No," I said firmly. "My children wouldn't have done this to me. My children would have respected my autonomy and protected my interests. You're strangers who happen to share my DNA." The finality in my voice seemed to break something in both of them. David slumped in his chair like a marionette with cut strings, while Rebecca's tears turned from manipulation to genuine despair. "What happens now?" Dr. Harrison asked quietly. "Now you face the consequences of your choices," I replied. Federal agents will arrive within hours. They'll seize all financial records, computer systems, and relevant documents. They'll interview every resident and staff member, and they'll begin building cases against everyone involved in this operation. And if we cooperate? Mrs. Chen asked from the doorway. Cooperation might influence sentencing, but it won't prevent prosecution. Too many people have been victimized, and too much money has been stolen. This is going to court. Martha sat down beside me, her presence a reminder that we weren't isolated victims anymore. We were organized witnesses with documented evidence and a clear understanding of our rights. Louise, she said quietly, there's something else you should know. I've been in contact with families of other residents. Some of them had no idea their relatives' money was being stolen. They thought they were paying for legitimate care. How many families? 15 so far. Once they understood what was happening, they started gathering their own evidence. Some of them have been trying to figure out why their parents' money was disappearing so quickly. The revelation added another layer to the conspiracy. Not all family members were actively participating in the theft. Some were being deceived by the same people who were victimizing their relatives. Those families would be valuable witnesses for prosecution, and their testimony would demonstrate that the scheme was sophisticated enough to fool even people who were trying to act in their loved ones' best interests. Mrs. Bennett, Dr. Harrison said desperately, surely we can reach some kind of agreement. This situation doesn't have to destroy everyone involved. Doctor, you falsified medical records to enable the theft of millions of dollars from vulnerable elderly people. You participated in a conspiracy that caused immeasurable harm to victims and their families. There is no agreement that could possibly address the scope of what you've done. Please, Rebecca begged one more time. We're your family. Family doesn't steal from each other, I replied. Family doesn't lie about medical conditions to justify warehousing their relatives. Family doesn't drug people into submission when they start asking inconvenient questions. I stood up, feeling the weight of 3 months of helplessness lifting from my shoulders. The FBI will be here at 2 o'clock. I suggest you use the remaining time to contact attorneys and prepare for the investigation that's about to turn your lives upside down. Where are you going? David asked. To the business center to make some phone calls. Unlike you, I have nothing to hide from law enforcement. As I walked away from the common room, I could hear them arguing in hushed voices about damage control and exit strategies. But it was too late for either. The evidence was already in federal hands. The witnesses were organized and prepared, and the conspiracy was about to be exposed in a way that would make national news. Martha caught up with me in the hallway. Louise, I need to tell you something else, about what happens after the investigation. What do you mean? This place is going to be shut down. The owners will be prosecuted, the staff will be scattered, and all of us residents will need somewhere else to go. She was right, and I hadn't fully considered the practical implications of bringing down Sunshine Manor. Exposing the conspiracy would protect future victims, but it would also displace all the current residents who would need alternative care arrangements. Where will everyone go? That depends, Martha said with a mysterious smile. I've been doing some research of my own. It turns out that facilities like this one can be purchased by private investors, especially when the current owners are facing federal prosecution and need to liquidate assets quickly. I stopped walking and stared at her. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that 2 women who've been systematically underestimated might be in a position to ensure that vulnerable elderly people receive the kind of care they actually deserve. The idea was audacious, but it wasn't impossible. If Sunshine Manor's current owners were facing asset forfeiture and criminal prosecution, the facility would need new management. Someone with experience in financial oversight and a personal understanding of elder abuse would be well qualified to run a nursing home that actually served residents' interests, rather than exploiting them. Martha, we're talking about millions of dollars in investment capital. We're talking about millions of dollars that were stolen from residents like us. If those assets are recovered through prosecution, they could be used to purchase and operate the facility under new management. That's incredibly complex legally, less complex than the fraud scheme we just exposed. And we've already demonstrated that we can organize evidence, coordinate with law enforcement, and hold sophisticated criminals accountable for their actions. I considered the possibilities as we continued toward the business center. Taking control of Sunshine Manor would allow us to transform it from a tool of exploitation into a genuine care facility. We could implement policies that protected residents' rights, maintained their autonomy, and provided actual medical care, rather than fraudulent assessments designed to justify theft. We'd need legal representation, financial backing, and regulatory approval, I said. We'd need those things anyway to recover our stolen money and pursue civil damages. The difference is whether we use that process to help ourselves or to help dozens of other victims. Martha was right. The legal machinery that would be set in motion by the FBI investigation would create opportunities for asset recovery and civil litigation. Those same legal processes could be leveraged to acquire and reform the facility that had been used to victimize us. There's something else to consider, I said. If we become the owners of this place, we'd have the authority to change visiting policies, staff assignments, and administrative procedures. Exactly, Martha replied with a grin that was positively predatory. Including the authority to restrict access for family members who've demonstrated a pattern of financial abuse. The implications were staggering. Rebecca and David, who had been using their status as family members to control and exploit me, would suddenly find themselves banned from the facility they'd used as a tool of manipulation. The power dynamic that had made me a victim would be completely reversed. We could set visiting hours based on residents' preferences rather than administrative convenience, I mused. We could require background checks for anyone seeking financial power of attorney. We could implement real medical oversight instead of rubber stamp evaluations. We could make this place into what nursing homes should be, sanctuaries that protect vulnerable people instead of prisons that enable their exploitation. The scope of the transformation was almost overwhelming to contemplate. But it was also the logical extension of everything we'd already accomplished. We'd exposed a criminal conspiracy, gathered evidence that would lead to prosecution, and organized witnesses who could testify about systematic abuse. Taking the next step to ensure long-term protection for vulnerable elderly people was simply the natural conclusion of our investigation. Martha, I said, I think we're about to embark on the most ambitious project of our lives. Louise, she replied, I think we're about to show a lot of people what happens when they underestimate elderly women who refuse to be victims. We reached the business center just as my phone began ringing. The caller ID showed a number I recognized from my research, the FBI field office that specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse cases. Mrs. Bennett? The voice was professional but warm. This is Agent Sarah Williams with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand you have information about organized financial crimes targeting nursing home residents. Agent Williams, I have comprehensive documentation of a racketeering operation that's been stealing millions of dollars from vulnerable elderly people. Are you available to meet this afternoon? I can be there in 2 hours with a full investigative team. Can you ensure your safety until we arrive? Agent Williams, I'm not in danger anymore. The people who are trying to silence me just realized that I'm the one who controls this situation now. Understood. We'll see you at 2 o'clock. I hung up the phone and looked at Martha, who was already pulling out her own documentation and recording devices. Ready to change the world? I asked. Ready to take control of it, she replied. At exactly 2 o'clock, 3 black SUVs pulled into Sunshine Manor's parking lot. Agent Williams and her team entered the building with search warrants, recording equipment, and the kind of professional competence that made it clear this wasn't their first investigation of elder abuse conspiracies. Rebecca and David had fled an hour earlier, probably to consult attorneys and develop damage control strategies. Dr. Harrison had barricaded himself in his office, making frantic phone calls to people who couldn't help him anymore. Mrs. Chen had simply disappeared, leaving behind a facility in chaos and dozens of residents who were finally beginning to understand that their exploitation was about to end. But Martha and I were calm, organized, and ready to begin the next phase of our plan. We had evidence, we had witnesses, and we had a vision for transforming Sunshine Manor from a tool of abuse into a model of genuine elder care. The game had changed completely, and we were no longer playing defense. We were in control now, and we intended to use that control to ensure that what had happened to us would never happen to anyone else. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated lobby of what was now called Evergreen Haven, watching the afternoon sun stream through windows that had been professionally cleaned for the first time in years. The institutional beige walls had been replaced with warm earth tones. Comfortable seating areas invited conversation rather than isolation, and the air smelled like fresh flowers instead of industrial disinfectant. The transformation had been more comprehensive than Martha and I had initially imagined. What started as a plan to expose financial abuse had evolved into a complete reformation of how elder care could be approached when residents' welfare was the actual priority rather than a convenient fiction. The FBI investigation had moved with remarkable speed once they realized the scope of the conspiracy. Agent Williams and her team had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud spanning 3 years and involving 47 families. The total amount of stolen assets exceeded $4.2 million, making it one of the largest elder abuse cases in the state's history. Rebecca and David had been arrested 2 weeks after the initial raid. Their attempt to flee to a non-extradition country had been thwarted by federal marshals who intercepted them at the airport with suitcases full of cash and falsified travel documents. The additional charges of flight to avoid prosecution and money laundering had eliminated any possibility of plea bargaining their way out of serious prison time. Dr. Harrison had been more cooperative, providing detailed testimony about the medical fraud aspects of the operation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His medical license had been permanently revoked, and he was serving 18 months in federal prison. More importantly, his testimony had led to the discovery of similar schemes operating at nursing facilities in 4 other states. Mrs. Chen had eventually been extradited from Mexico, where she'd attempted to establish a new identity using stolen resident information. Her role as the administrative coordinator of the conspiracy had made her particularly valuable to prosecutors, and her eventual cooperation had revealed the full organizational structure of the criminal enterprise. But the most satisfying outcome hadn't been the prosecutions, though those were certainly gratifying. The most satisfying outcome had been the implementation of our plan to acquire and transform Sunshine Manor into a facility that actually served residents' interests. The legal process had been complex, but ultimately straightforward. When Sunshine Manor's corporate owners faced asset forfeiture proceedings, they had been eager to sell the facility to avoid additional financial liability. The purchase price had been significantly below market value, reflecting both the urgency of the sale and the facility's tarnished reputation. Martha and I had formed a partnership with 3 other families whose relatives had been victimized by the conspiracy. Together, we had sufficient resources to purchase the facility and implement comprehensive reforms. More importantly, we had the personal experience and motivation necessary to ensure that vulnerable elderly people would be protected rather than exploited. The residents who had chosen to remain at the facility had participated in planning the transformation. Those who were mentally competent had formed a resident council with actual authority over policies that affected their daily lives. Those who required more intensive care received genuine medical attention from licensed professionals who were accountable to oversight boards rather than profit margins. We had also implemented strict protocols for family involvement in residents' care. Anyone seeking power of attorney was required to undergo background checks and financial auditing. Family members with a history of financial impropriety were restricted from unsupervised visits. Most importantly, residents retained control over their own finances, unless they specifically requested assistance and received independent legal counsel before making such arrangements. The visiting policy had been one of the most dramatic changes. Instead of rigid institutional schedules designed for staff convenience, visiting hours were now determined by residents' preferences and individual circumstances. Some residents enjoyed frequent family contact and maintained open visiting policies. Others, particularly those who had been victimized by family members, had implemented strict limitations that protected them from unwanted interference. Rebecca and David were among those whose visiting privileges had been permanently revoked. The legal documentation of their theft and conspiracy made them ineligible for any contact with me unless specifically authorized by court order. They had attempted to argue that such restrictions violated their rights as family members, But federal judges had been unsympathetic to convicted felons claiming victimization by their own victims. The psychological impact of that reversal had been more profound than I had anticipated. For 3 months, I had been powerless to prevent my own children from controlling every aspect of my life. Now they required my permission to so much as send me a letter. The transformation from victim to authority figure had been therapeutic in ways that traditional counseling could never have achieved. Martha had thrived in her new role as Director of Resident Services. Her experience as a victim of financial abuse had given her unique insight into the vulnerabilities that predatory family members exploited. She had developed training programs for staff members that helped them recognize signs of exploitation and respond appropriately to protect residents' interests. One of her most innovative programs involved peer counseling for residents who had experienced family betrayal. Many elderly people who discovered that their own relatives had been stealing from them experienced profound depression and isolation. Martha's support groups provided a space where victims could share their experiences and develop strategies for rebuilding their lives after such devastating betrayals. My own role as executive director had allowed me to implement the kind of financial oversight that should have existed from the beginning. Every resident's account was monitored by independent auditors who reported directly to a board of trustees rather than facility management. Any unusual financial activity triggered immediate investigation and, if necessary, protective intervention. We had also established partnerships with legal aid organizations that provided free consultation to residents who suspected financial abuse. Many elderly people had been afraid to report suspicious activity by family members because they couldn't afford legal representation or didn't understand their rights. Our program ensured that vulnerable residents had access to professional advocacy regardless of their financial circumstances. The success of Evergreen Haven had attracted attention from regulatory agencies and elder care advocates across the country. We had hosted dozens of delegations from other states who wanted to understand how a resident-controlled facility could operate profitably while maintaining high standards of care and protection. The answer, we had discovered, was relatively simple. When you eliminated the systematic theft that had been disguising itself as administrative costs, nursing homes could provide excellent care while maintaining financial stability. The money that had been flowing to shell companies and fraudulent contractors was more than sufficient to fund superior staffing, improved facilities, and comprehensive services. We had also implemented technology solutions that previous management had claimed were too expensive. Electronic medical records with multi-level authorization prevented unauthorized access to sensitive information. Financial monitoring systems flagged unusual account activity in real time. Communication systems allowed residents to maintain contact with approved family members, while blocking unwanted intrusion from problematic relatives. But the most significant change had been cultural rather than technological. Evergreen Haven operated on the principle that residents were autonomous adults who deserved respect, dignity, and self-determination. Staff members were trained to support residents' choices rather than override them for institutional convenience. The contrast with our previous experience was stark. Instead of being treated like children who couldn't be trusted with basic decisions, residents were consulted about their care plans, included in facility governance, and supported in maintaining their independence to the greatest extent possible. The dining room exemplified this transformation. Instead of institutional cafeteria service with limited options, residents could choose from multiple meal selections prepared by professional chefs who understood that food quality significantly impacted quality of life. Special dietary needs were accommodated rather than dismissed, and residents could invite family members or friends to share meals in a welcoming environment. The activity programs had also been completely redesigned. Instead of patronizing craft sessions designed to keep residents busy, we offered educational classes, professional development workshops, and skill-sharing programs that acknowledged residents' expertise and experience. Many residents had professional backgrounds that could benefit other residents, and our programs facilitated those connections. One of the most popular innovations had been the financial literacy workshops that Martha and I conducted monthly. We taught residents how to recognize signs of financial abuse, understand their legal rights, and protect themselves from exploitation. The workshops also covered estate planning, power of attorney alternatives, and strategies for maintaining financial independence while receiving care. These programs had attracted participants from outside Evergreen Haven, including family members who wanted to better understand how to support elderly relatives without overriding their autonomy. The workshops had become so popular that we had established a waiting list and begun offering online versions for people who couldn't attend in person. The legal aftermath of the conspiracy had continued to unfold in ways that benefited victims. Civil litigation against the participants had recovered most of the stolen assets, which had been distributed to victims or used to fund enhanced services at Evergreen Haven. Several insurance companies had also been held liable for failing to detect obvious fraud patterns, resulting in additional compensation for victims. More importantly, the case had led to legislative reforms that strengthened protection for vulnerable elderly people. New laws required more rigorous oversight of power of attorney arrangements, enhanced penalties for elder abuse, and improved training for financial institutions to recognize suspicious account activity. The media attention surrounding the case had also raised public awareness about the prevalence of elder abuse and the sophisticated methods that criminals use to exploit vulnerable people. The story had been featured in national news programs, documentary films, and academic studies that helped educate families about protecting elderly relatives from financial predators. But for me personally, the most meaningful outcome had been the restoration of my sense of agency and purpose. 3 months of being treated like an incompetent invalid had been profoundly demoralizing. Taking control of my situation and using my experience to protect other vulnerable people had been therapeutically transformative. I had also reconnected with parts of my identity that had been suppressed during my marriage and motherhood. The financial investigation and facility management skills that I had developed during my career had found new application in protecting elderly residents and reforming institutional practices. I felt more professionally engaged and intellectually challenged than I had in years. The personal relationships I had developed with other residents had also been unexpectedly rewarding. Instead of the superficial interactions that had characterized my social life when I was trying to maintain the fiction of family harmony, I now had friendships based on shared experience, mutual respect, and genuine compatibility. Martha had become my closest confidant and business partner. Our shared experience of family betrayal had created a bond that went deeper than typical friendship. We understood each other's anger, determination, and commitment to preventing other people from experiencing similar victimization. We had also developed friendships with several residents whose families had been genuinely supportive during their placement at Evergreen Haven. These relationships had helped restore my faith in the possibility of healthy family dynamics, and had provided models for how adult children could support elderly parents without undermining their autonomy. The contrast between these healthy relationships and my own experience with Rebecca and David had been illuminating. I had begun to understand that their behavior hadn't been an unfortunate aberration, but rather the culmination of patterns that had existed throughout our relationship. Their willingness to steal from me and warehouse me in a nursing home had been consistent with a lifetime of treating me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The grief I felt about losing my children had been complicated by relief about escaping their manipulation. The legal proceedings had provided closure by establishing clear consequences for their behavior and protecting me from future exploitation. I no longer had to wonder whether I was being paranoid or oversensitive about their treatment of me. The evidence was documented and undeniable. The financial recovery had also been more comprehensive than I had initially expected. In addition to recovering most of my stolen assets, the civil litigation had resulted in punitive damages that reflected the particularly egregious nature of the conspiracy. The additional compensation had provided resources for establishing a foundation that supported elder abuse victims and funded research into prevention strategies. The Evergreen Foundation had become my primary focus outside of facility management. We provided grants to legal aid organizations, funded research into elder abuse prevention, and supported advocacy efforts to strengthen protective legislation. The foundation had also established a scholarship program for social workers specializing in elder protection and a training institute for nursing home administrators committed to ethical practices. One of the foundation's most successful programs had been the Family Education Initiative that helped adult children understand how to support elderly parents without usurping their authority. Many cases of financial abuse began with good intentions but escalated into exploitation when family members assumed too much control over their relatives' lives. The program taught families how to recognize the difference between supportive assistance and manipulative control. It provided tools for having difficult conversations about care needs, financial planning, and end-of-life preferences, while respecting elderly people's right to make their own decisions. We had also developed resources for elderly people who wanted to protect themselves from potential abuse while maintaining family relationships. These materials included information about limited power of attorney arrangements, third-party financial monitoring, and legal safeguards that could prevent unauthorized access to assets. The success of these programs had led to expansion beyond our local area. We had established partnerships with organizations in 12 states and had begun developing online resources that could be accessed by families anywhere in the country. The goal was to create a national network of support for vulnerable, elderly people and their families. But the most personally satisfying aspect of the Foundation's work had been the direct assistance we provided to individual victims of elder abuse. The Foundation maintained a hotline that connected victims with legal advocates, financial counselors, and support services. Many callers were in situations similar to what I had experienced: isolated, confused, and unsure whether their suspicions about family members were justified. The Foundation's advocates helped these victims document suspicious activity, understand their legal rights, and develop safety plans that protected them from retaliation. We had assisted in recovering over $2 million in stolen assets and had helped dozens of victims escape exploitative situations. These individual success stories had been more rewarding than any of the broader systemic changes we had implemented. Each person we helped represented a life that had been restored, independence that had been preserved, and dignity that had been protected. The annual Resident Appreciation Dinner had become one of my favorite events at Evergreen Haven. Unlike the institutional gatherings that had characterized Sunshine Manor, these celebrations were genuine parties where residents, staff, and approved family members came together to commemorate the community we had built. This year's dinner had been particularly meaningful because it marked the first anniversary of the facility's transformation. Many residents who had been victims of the original conspiracy had chosen to remain at Evergreen Haven because they felt safer and more respected than they had in years. During my speech at the dinner, I had reflected on the journey from victimization to empowerment that had brought us to this point. A year ago, many of us felt powerless and isolated. We had been betrayed by people we trusted, exploited by institutions that were supposed to protect us, and dismissed by systems that should have listened to our concerns. Today, we live in a community where our voices matter, our choices are respected, and our welfare is the genuine priority. We have transformed from victims into advocates, from isolated individuals into a supportive community, and from powerless elderly people into empowered adults who control our own lives. The applause had been thunderous, but the most meaningful responses had been the individual conversations afterward. Residents had shared stories about how the changes at Evergreen Haven had restored their confidence, improved their relationships with supportive family members, and given them hope for their future. Martha had given the closing speech, focusing on the lessons we had learned about the importance of never underestimating elderly people's capacity for resilience, intelligence, and determination. "The people who tried to exploit us made a fundamental error," she had said. "They assumed that age equals vulnerability, that dependence equals helplessness, and that isolation equals powerlessness. They discovered that elderly women who refuse to be victims can be formidable opponents. They learned that underestimating people based on their age and circumstances can be a costly mistake. And they found out that when vulnerable people organize and fight back, they can achieve outcomes that seemed impossible." The evening had concluded with presentations of service awards to staff members who had embraced the facility's new culture of respect and advocacy. These employees had demonstrated that providing excellent elder care was both professionally rewarding and financially sustainable when approached with integrity and genuine commitment to residents' welfare. As I prepared for bed that night in my comfortable apartment within Evergreen Haven, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred over the past year. I had evolved from a confused and isolated nursing home resident into the executive director of a nationally recognized elder care facility. More importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of purpose, autonomy, and dignity. The legal consequences for Rebecca and David had been severe but appropriate. Rebecca was serving 4 years in federal prison for her role in organizing the conspiracy, while David had received 3 years for his participation in the financial fraud. They would also face years of probation, substantial financial penalties, and permanent restrictions on their ability to serve as financial guardians for vulnerable adults. The criminal proceedings had established clear legal boundaries that protected me from future contact or interference. Rebecca and David could not approach me, communicate with me, or attempt to influence my decisions without court authorization. The restraining orders would remain in effect indefinitely, providing permanent protection from the people who had betrayed my trust so completely. But beyond the legal protections, I had built a life that was fulfilling, meaningful, and secure. My work at Evergreen Haven and the Foundation provided intellectual challenge and professional satisfaction. My friendships with other residents and staff members provided social connection and emotional support. My financial security had been restored and protected through sophisticated oversight and legal safeguards. Most importantly, I had demonstrated to myself and others that elderly people could be powerful advocates for change when given the opportunity and support to exercise their capabilities. The assumption that age inevitably led to vulnerability and dependence had been thoroughly debunked by our success in transforming Sunshine Manor and establishing Evergreen Haven. The ripple effects of our efforts continued to expand. Other nursing facilities had adopted similar resident empowerment models after seeing our success. Regulatory agencies had strengthened oversight procedures based on lessons learned from our case. Families across the country had implemented better protection strategies for elderly relatives after learning about our experience. But perhaps the most significant impact had been cultural. The story of Evergreen Haven had challenged stereotypes about elderly people's capacity for leadership, innovation, and resilience. Media coverage had portrayed us not as sympathetic victims who needed protection, but as competent adults who had identified problems and implemented solutions. This shift in narrative had been personally liberating. Instead of being defined by what had been done to me, I was now recognized for what I had accomplished. The victimization that had brought me to Sunshine Manor had become the catalyst for achievements that were more meaningful than anything I had accomplished during my earlier career. The visiting policy at Evergreen Haven had become one of its most discussed features. Unlike traditional nursing homes where families could visit during prescribed hours regardless of residents' preferences, our policy required mutual consent for all visits. Residents could establish whatever level of family contact felt comfortable and safe for them. Some residents maintained close relationships with supportive family members and welcomed frequent visits. Others had chosen limited contact with relatives who had been difficult but not abusive. A few, like myself, had completely severed relationships with family members who had demonstrated patterns of exploitation or manipulation. This flexibility had been controversial among some family advocacy groups who argued that adult children had inherent rights to maintain contact with elderly parents. But legal challenges to our policy had been unsuccessful because courts recognized that competent adults had the right to control their own social relationships, regardless of family connections. The policy had also created interesting dynamics for families who wanted to repair relationships damaged by previous conflicts. Some adult children who had been restricted from visiting had made genuine efforts to understand and address their problematic behavior. When residents chose to allow gradual reconnection, the process was carefully supervised to ensure that vulnerable people were protected from renewed manipulation. But in cases where family members remained unrepentant about their exploitation or continued to display manipulative behavior, the restrictions remained in place. The facility's primary obligation was to protect residents' welfare, not to facilitate family relationships that were harmful to vulnerable people. The financial oversight systems at Evergreen Haven had become a model for other facilities. Instead of allowing families unlimited access to residents' accounts, we required regular auditing, transparent reporting, and independent advocacy for any significant financial decisions. Residents retained control over their assets unless they specifically requested assistance and received independent legal counsel. These protections had prevented several potential cases of financial abuse since the facility's transformation. Family members who attempted to gain inappropriate access to residents' assets were identified early and prevented from completing their schemes. The early intervention protected both residents and families from the devastating consequences of financial exploitation. The success of these protective measures had attracted attention from financial institutions seeking to improve their own elder abuse prevention programs. Banks and investment firms had sent representatives to study our procedures and had implemented similar safeguards for their elderly clients. The educational programs at Evergreen Haven had also evolved into a comprehensive curriculum that addressed multiple aspects of successful aging. In addition to financial literacy and abuse prevention, we offered classes on technology, health advocacy, legal rights, and end-of-life planning. These programs attracted participants from throughout the region, including elderly people who lived independently but wanted to better understand how to protect themselves from potential exploitation. The classes had become so popular that we had expanded into online offerings and had begun developing partnerships with senior centers and community organizations. One of the most successful courses was Family Dynamics and Elder Protection, which taught participants how to recognize manipulation, set appropriate boundaries, and maintain healthy relationships with adult children. The course materials had been adapted for use by other organizations and had become a standard resource for elder protection advocates. The research component of the Evergreen Foundation had produced several academic studies that contributed to professional understanding of elder abuse patterns and prevention strategies. Our unique position as former victims who had become facility administrators provided insights that were unavailable to traditional researchers. These studies had been published in professional journals and had influenced policy development at state and federal levels. The research had also been cited in legal proceedings involving elder abuse cases, helping prosecutors and advocates understand the sophisticated methods that criminals use to exploit vulnerable people. But beyond the academic and policy contributions, the research had provided validation for victims who had been told that their experiences were unusual or exaggerated. The documentation of systematic abuse patterns helped victims understand that they were not alone and that their experiences were part of a broader problem that required systemic solutions. The media attention surrounding Evergreen Haven had also created opportunities for advocacy and education that extended far beyond our facility. I had been invited to speak at conferences, participate in documentary films, and contribute to legislative hearings about elder protection. These speaking engagements had been professionally rewarding but also personally therapeutic. Sharing my story publicly had helped process the trauma of betrayal while contributing to broader efforts to protect vulnerable people. The positive responses from audiences had reinforced my sense of purpose and validated the importance of our work. The transformation of my personal identity had been as significant as the institutional changes we had implemented. 3 years ago, I had been a widow whose primary identity was defined by my relationships with my children and my role as their mother. The discovery of their betrayal had shattered that identity and forced me to reconstruct my sense of self. The process had been painful but ultimately liberating. I had rediscovered professional capabilities that had been dormant for years. I had developed new friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than family obligation. I had created a legacy that was meaningful and sustainable, rather than dependent on other people's choices. The financial security provided by the asset recovery and foundation work had also restored my independence in ways that went beyond simple economics. I no longer had to depend on anyone else for support or approval. I could make decisions based on my own preferences and values, rather than trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't respect my autonomy. This independence had been particularly valuable in dealing with attempts by Rebecca and David to re-establish contact after their release from prison. Through intermediaries, they had expressed interest in apologizing and rebuilding our relationship. But their continued focus on what they wanted rather than acknowledging the harm they had caused suggested that their fundamental attitudes hadn't changed. The legal restrictions prevented direct contact, but I had made it clear through attorneys that I had no interest in reconciliation. The relationship had been permanently damaged by their betrayal, and I had built a new life that didn't include them. Their absence was a relief rather than a loss. The contrast between my current relationships and my previous family dynamics had been illuminating. The people in my life now treated me with respect, valued my opinions, and supported my independence. They celebrated my accomplishments rather than trying to diminish them, and they respected my boundaries rather than trying to override them. These healthy relationship patterns had helped me understand how abnormal my family dynamics had been. The manipulation, dismissal, and exploitation that I had experienced from Rebecca and David had not been unfortunate aberrations but rather the predictable outcome of fundamental disrespect for my autonomy and dignity. Understanding this pattern had been essential for my recovery and had informed the educational programs we developed for other victims. Many elderly people who experienced family betrayal struggled with guilt and self-blame because they had assumed that their children's behavior reflected their own failures as parents. The reality was often the opposite. Adult children who exploited elderly parents typically displayed patterns of entitlement and manipulation that had existed throughout the relationship. The elder abuse was simply the culmination of long-standing disrespect rather than a sudden change in character. This understanding had helped many victims process their experiences and develop appropriate responses to family betrayal. Instead of trying to repair relationships with people who had demonstrated fundamental disrespect for their welfare, victims could focus on building new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine caring. The anniversary celebration at Evergreen Haven had concluded with the announcement of our next major initiative: the development of a training institute for nursing home administrators who wanted to implement resident-centered care models. The institute would provide comprehensive education about elder protection, financial oversight, and community-building strategies that promoted dignity and autonomy for elderly residents. The training program would be the culmination of everything we had learned about transforming institutional elder care, from a model of control and exploitation to one of support and empowerment. Graduates of the program would return to their facilities with practical tools for implementing systemic changes that protected vulnerable residents while maintaining operational efficiency. The Institute represented my vision for the next phase of our advocacy work. Instead of simply operating one exemplary facility, we would train administrators across the country to implement similar reforms in their own communities. The multiplier effect could potentially impact thousands of elderly people who deserved better protection and more respectful care. As I looked toward the future, I felt optimistic about the continued expansion of our impact and the ongoing development of more effective protection strategies for vulnerable elderly people. The transformation from victim to advocate had been personally fulfilling, but the broader social change we had catalyzed felt like the more important legacy. The legal system had demonstrated that elderly victims could successfully pursue justice against sophisticated criminal conspiracies when they had adequate support and documentation. The regulatory environment had been strengthened to provide better protection for future victims. The public awareness of elder abuse had been significantly increased through media coverage of our case. But most importantly, we had demonstrated that elderly people could be powerful agents of change when given the opportunity to exercise their capabilities. The stereotypes about age-related vulnerability and dependence had been challenged by our success in building a thriving business, implementing innovative programs, and creating a model for respectful elder care. The message for other potential victims was clear. Exploitation was not inevitable, helplessness was not permanent, and age did not preclude the possibility of fighting back effectively against those who would take advantage of vulnerability. The final lesson from our experience was perhaps the most important. Underestimating elderly people, particularly elderly women who had been dismissed and marginalized, could be a very costly mistake for those who sought to exploit them. As I settled into my comfortable apartment that night, surrounded by the security and dignity that we had fought to create, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately become the catalyst for achievements that were more meaningful than anything I had previously imagined possible. The transformation from Louise Bennett, confused nursing home resident, to Louise Bennett, nationally recognized elder care advocate, had been complete. And tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more victims to help, and more institutional changes to implement in service of protecting vulnerable people who deserved better than society had previously been willing to provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.